Press the record button. Welcome to Everything's a Block, how WordPress rewrote the WYSIWYG. I'm Steve Persch, lead developer advocate at Pantheon. You can find me all over the internet as Steve Vector, Drupal.org, GitHub, Twitter, just about everywhere. If you need my email address, there it is. Also soon to be a Minneapolis resident. Very excited about that. Yeah, yes. Closing on a house next month. Yesterday, St. Paul Tim tweeted out a link or a screenshot of the first presentation that I did at Twin Cities Drupal Camp 6 years ago, and I could tell right away going to that camp that the Twin Cities Drupal community was a really special place. And it only took me 6 years to move up here, but better late than never. So today we will be talking primarily about Gutenberg. This is a GIF of what the new Gutenberg editor looks like in WordPress. It's pretty slick, super cool. If you want to just play around with it, within like 5 minutes you can spin up a free Pantheon site with WordPress, install Gutenberg, and see what it's like. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit more conceptually. Before getting into some of the nuts and bolts of Gutenberg, I just want to talk about the idea of blocks, Lego blocks. I got into web development over a decade ago. I was a theater major coming out of college, and I often had to explain to friends and family just how I got into web development. And one of the ways I did that was by saying, well, it's a lot like playing with Legos. I'm working with WordPress and Drupal and their systems where you have a core software. Then you have all these plugins and modules and themes that you can add together and combine, and it's a lot like playing with Legos. Did anyone else use that metaphor when explaining their jobs to people who aren't web developers? I'm seeing some hands getting raised here. And for a while I thought, yeah, this is a good explanation. This is what I'm doing. I'm playing with Legos and getting paid for it. What a wonderful job. But a couple years ago, this metaphor kind of stopped working for me, at least for one part of the job. For one part of building Drupal sites, I felt like this really wasn't making sense anymore, the more that I thought about it. A few years ago, the Drupal community really started talking about the idea of front-end design components, that we need to start thinking about our front end, the markup that we print, the stuff we're putting on our web pages. We should be thinking of each thing on the page as its own block. And I'm thinking, yeah, Lego blocks. That's what I've been thinking all along. That's what we're doing. We're putting blocks of stuff onto our page. Drupal has a thing called blocks. It's right there in core, of course. There are blocks. Well, if you were to talk to a front-end developer, someone who's not necessarily deeply familiar with Drupal or hasn't used Drupal at all, and said, here's something that Drupal can display. This is a screenshot, just a fraction of a page that I took from Drupal.org, from my own Drupal.org bio. This should be a pretty simple design component, right? If we're thinking about this as a front-end component, what's the markup necessary to render this component? We need something probably wrapping the whole thing. We probably need something wrapping current roles, maybe a strong or a bold tag to indicate this needs to be bold. Maybe there's some CSS that takes care of the bolding. Probably just need a line break between current roles and lead developer advocate, and lead developer advocate just needs to not be bold. It could be just unstyled text, and then maybe another line break before an image. That's probably all we need, like a bold line, maybe that's a heading, but pretty simple, lead developer advocate and an image. Now, I'm guessing most of the people in the room are Drupal people, and you know that that's not what the markup is. You probably know that the markup that Drupal is giving us here is a lot more complex. Does anyone have a guess as to the number of wrapping divs between current roles and lead developer advocate? The number of wrapping divs.
12.
3, 4.
7. I was hearing numbers there between, I think 3 is the lowest number I heard, I think 12 is the highest number I heard. The actual number for my Drupal.org profile page, the number of wrapping divs between current role and lead developer advocate is 7. These are really, really granular Lego pieces. If you want to apply the Lego metaphor to the markup you get from Drupal, you need to be thinking in terms of very, very narrow Lego pieces. They're the Lego pieces that are just like the thinnest possible slice of a Lego piece. If you're interested in why does Drupal do that, there are like many historical reasons for why Drupal basically takes all of its internal data structures and gives you each layer of the data structure as one or more wrapping HTML element. If you're interested in why exactly does Drupal do that, I recommend looking at a presentation I did 3 years ago here at Twin Cities Drupal Camp, rendering HTML with Drupal past, present, and future, walks through much of that history, because there are reasons we wanted to do it that way years ago. It's not an accident. It's not like people were just trying to make it hard for front-end developers. But the end result, one of my favorite slides from that presentation, was that it can often feel like playing Plinko to render HTML with Drupal. You're putting in your data, it bounces through a million layers of wrapping templates, and out the other side, maybe you get what you want, maybe you don't. This is, I think, a funny metaphor, but it's maybe not the most accurate way of thinking about it. One way I like to think about it now is that when it comes to markup, your two main options are something like sketching or something like sculpting. A lot of people look at the markup that comes out of Drupal and says, this is terrible, I want none of it. I'm going to start with a blank template file, a blank metaphorical piece of paper, and sketch exactly the markup that I want. That's one way to do it. Basically, start from the opening body tag all the way to the closing body tag, write exactly the HTML you want. And people did that, going back many major versions of Drupal. Not the majority of Drupalists, though. I think the majority of us did something much more close to sculpting, where Drupal gives us these big chunks or blobs of clay. You get 7 wrapping divs, and your task as the developer who needs to make the Drupal site look like the Photoshop comp, or needs to make the Drupal site look like the Illustrator comp, your task is basically to shave away the pieces of HTML that aren't helping, maybe add some paint in the form of CSS, and just massage and shape the clay that you have in all this markup until it looks right, and then you're done. I think it's much closer to sculpting than it is to sculpting in clay, I should say, than it is to building sculptures in Lego blocks. And you've got a million choices for what layers do you do your shaving and your sculpting in. You can work directly in hook theme. More likely that you're going to be overriding templates, but you can pre-process templates rather than directly override the end templates. You can work in render elements. You can work in layout plugins. That was my preferred way of thinking about how I'm going to control my chunks of elements. Yesterday, Brian Perry here did a presentation on UI patterns, probably one of the best ways now to think about how you're going to control your chunks, your blocks of markup, if you wanted to be thinking in this way in Drupal 8 now. But there's also view modes, field formatters, a bunch of things in views module, their block types themselves, their beans. Ultimately, I think there are just too many ways of thinking about what our chunks are. But again, if you want to know the best way to do this in Drupal now, I recommend watching the video of Brian's session from yesterday, component-based theming with UI patterns and Pattern Lab. In very, very short summary, it shows you how you can go from something like Pattern Lab, a tool that lets you figure out exactly the HTML you want, and then implement that in Drupal. One of the most popular ways of giving your clients control over those design components in Drupal right now, especially in Drupal 8, is paragraphs module. The idea of paragraphs module is for each of those design components, for each of those things you want your client to be able to control, make a paragraph type, maybe a paragraph type with some selectors that let you switch between your different design components, and basically you build up a list of paragraph entities, sometimes paragraphs within paragraphs, and that is the way your editors can control these design components. It's a very Drupal-y way of doing it. Basically, fields inside of entities inside of other entities, but it gets the job done. But it's a solution that I think preferences the site builders over content editors. Now I'm going to transition into the way WordPress is thinking. WordPress, of course, recognizes that there are site builders there who are more concerned with controlling the overall page, who are concerned with assembling complete websites, who are often thinking more systematically about the whole. But WordPress as a community is far more likely to prioritize highly the needs of content creators, the people who are more likely to be thinking out about what's happening inside the body field, perhaps, of your content, of your article. What's happening with the data itself? So WordPress, rather than starting with site building tools and making them content editing tools, as Drupal tends to do, is starting with something that is a content editing tool first, and then making it more and more powerful, and eventually a tool that can be used for site building. So if you were to install WordPress today, you would still get the same old WYSIWYG editor that you've seen for the last decade. This new Gutenberg editor isn't in core yet. So what you get now is still a relatively familiar looking WYSIWYG. You can embed images, and that's nice. WordPress has this concept of short codes that's basically 10 years old at this point. If you want something more dynamic, like a Google map embed, you can put it in short codes. Basically, put in square brackets, and then inside the square brackets, there are very specific parameters you enter for things like, I want it to be width 400 pixels, and height 200 pixels, and zoom level of 5, and you just have to know what 5 is. I think this is similar to if you're using paragraphs module in Drupal. You just have to know what all those different select options are going to do, and imagine in your mind what they're going to mean when they render out to the general public. WordPress has its own equivalent of CCK, of structured fields, that Drupal had. It's still out there in Contrib. It's called Advanced Custom Fields plugin. But the Gutenberg editor is rethinking all of that. The Gutenberg editor is a block-based editor. One of the things you may notice about Gutenberg when you first play with it is that it's just a nicer, more modern-looking WYSIWYG editor. It's more visually compelling. It lets you do all sorts of things. As the GIF loops around here again, we'll see that it lets you control colors of the text, bold italics, of course. It is a WYSIWYG after all. One nice detail here is when we select a bad color combination for accessibility, it warns us that color combination is bad for accessibility. I think that's the kind of thing that happens when you have the content editor's perspective in mind. It's a better fulfillment of just the idea of what you see is what you get, rather than having to keep in mind what's going to happen when you do the shortcode for the Google map, or having to keep in mind on the Drupal side what all the paragraph entities will actually look like. You just see. You see what it is that you are going to get. You see the Google map as the end users will see it on the public side. You can interact with it, and it's a better fulfillment of the idea of a WYSIWYG. Adding images is really easy here. So here I'm using a slash shortcode. I'm just hitting on the keyboard the slash character, and then I type IMA, and that auto-completes to image, and I say, yes, I want an image, and then, oh, I want to convert the image to an image gallery. This idea of converting one block type to another block type is really cool. This feels easier than adding images or image galleries anytime I've done that in Drupal. I've said the word block here a few times. Again, the block is the way Gutenberg structures these ideas. It lets you know that all these different things that you might want to put into your content, a block quote, a code embed, a YouTube embed, a big cover image, all of those are represented as blocks, and you can just see the full list of all the blocks that are available to you. You can put blocks inside of other blocks. Here we see a column block where we can basically nest one block inside of another. This is still a relatively new experimental feature, still getting worked out exactly how this is going to go. Gutenberg has this idea of static blocks versus dynamic blocks. So for a static block, what it means is the markup that you might imagine for one of these blocks, a heading, and H2 and H3, that's just what gets saved to the database. So if it's a heading, if it's a block quote, the markup you might imagine is all that is saved to the database. Whereas a dynamic block is something that is going to be re-rendered over and over again for the general public. So for something like a recent posts block, it defaults to 5 recent posts. And that's something that's going to need to be reprocessed over and over again, because you could be adding posts at any time. You want new posts to show up in the latest post block. So what gets stored in the database here is a reference to the block type latest posts, and the configuration items. I want 6 latest posts rather than 5, and I want it to be rendered in 2 columns rather than 1 column. So those are the data attributes that need to be saved. There's the idea of reusable blocks. Basically, you can add a block and then decide, oh, this is something that's going to be needed in lots of different places. I'm going to designate this block as reusable. So what happens there is this block gets saved on its own in the database. You can update it once as it's used in one post, and then it'll update in any other post that it's used in. There's the idea of templating things out. One of the first things I thought about when I saw Gutenberg was, well, yeah, but what about like content types, and the idea that certain content types need different fields? Well, they've got that covered here. WordPress has the idea of post types rather than content types, and it's pretty easy in Gutenberg to just say for a given post type, like a bio page, that's going to need the person's name, it's going to need their job title, an image, and then a bio, and those are all just available to be pre-filled in. The data model is probably the part that's going to be most controversial for a Drupal audience. Rather than storing all of these blocks separately to the database, they're stored in the body field. WordPress as a community really values the body field. Their assumption is that WordPress exists for the content. Their mission as a community is to democratize publishing. One of the ways they fulfill that is by making the body field as understandable as possible by as wide of an audience as possible. And their assumption is that if they can just save HTML to the body, and if they can continue doing that, that will be a better fulfillment of democratizing publishing. It'll help maintain backwards compatibility because there's 10 or 15 years of plugins that expect the body field to be something meaningful. They don't expect the body field to just be references and references and references. Sure, there is a need for some references. If you make a reusable block, if you make that latest post block, those aren't getting saved as just their HTML, they're getting saved as more references. So the blocks here are getting delineated by HTML comments. I was telling people about this at the welcome party 2 nights ago, and there was a lot of surprise that WordPress would serialize JSON inside of an HTML comment. But they have their reasons for doing all of these things, and I'll get into that a little bit later. One detail I want to point out about this editor is that most of the editor doesn't have to worry about where this is getting saved. This decision about saving it as one big chunk of HTML, most of the editor doesn't know that. When the editor loads, all the blocks get parsed out of that big body field. So as far as the editor is concerned, it's just one big blob of, well, it's a blob of JSON with the blocks inside of it, getting serialized and deserialized as it goes in and out. All right, so I mentioned that it's written in React. How did WordPress, a community that, like Drupal, is based in PHP developers, a community that historically has been a little hesitant to embrace more modern web development practices. WordPress as a community still supports PHP 5.2, at least when it comes to the core software. So how did WordPress suddenly build a pretty sophisticated React-based editor? And I should point out here that the editor is React-based. That is not to say that when the site gets rendered out to the public, it's using React. React is just there to edit relatively normal HTML. What gets served out to the public in most cases is relatively normal HTML. So how did the WordPress community get to a point where it was comfortable going full steam into React, Webpack, and a bunch of other things that were outside of its comfort zone relatively recently? So one feature WordPress added back in 2012 was the customizer. This is a feature that even people in WordPress often don't know about. It's a feature that allows themes in WordPress to declare certain sections of their theme as customizable. You can, if you're writing a WordPress theme, declare the page title customizable. You can declare certain sections of the page as customizable. And if you do so, basically what you get is a pretty slick JavaScript application that allows you to, in the browser, in a kind of what you see is what you get way, modify the page, save it even in an unpublished fashion so that you can send a link to your coworkers to your unpublished config changes and they can see it. And it's incredibly powerful. It does all sorts of cool things. Themes are even required to use it if they want to have some kind of custom settings. So it again allows for drafting and scheduling. It lazy loads things from the REST API, dynamic, inline editing preview, but it's not all that widely used. I wish I could tell you exactly why it's not all that widely used. But I think to a certain degree it didn't change enough. For a lot of people, they were comfortable using their same set of plugins they had always used. Another change that some people expected to fully revolutionize the way WordPress worked with JavaScript was a tool that was released in late 2015 called Calypso. This was a project done by Automatic. Automatic is kind of like the Acquia of the WordPress community. And the idea behind Calypso is it's an application that you can run on your local machine. It happened to be built in React Native. And with this native application, you can then control a lot of WordPress sites. So it was built primarily for WordPress.com, a hosted WordPress solution that Automatic has. And wouldn't it be amazing if with a local application, the speed and UI niceties of a local application, you could control your whole fleet of WordPress sites? A lot of people thought, oh wow, this is going to completely change everything. But quite honestly, it didn't completely change everything for the WordPress community. It did not gain huge community-wide adoption. I think for one reason, it expected the users to have a WordPress.com account, even if you weren't necessarily interacting with sites on WordPress.com itself. You could be interacting with self-hosted sites, but you still had to tie into WordPress.com to use Calypso. I think that was a non-starter for a lot of people. But perhaps the deeper issue was that it didn't completely change what you could do with the WordPress sites. It sure gave you a cool native application that let you administer your WordPress sites, but you were still posting the same kinds of posts, administering the same kinds of pages. Your WordPress sites themselves didn't necessarily change because you were interacting with them because of Calypso. Okay, so still around the time Calypso comes out, at the state of the word, basically the WordPress equivalent of the Dries note that we have here in the Drupal community, the keynote address from the leader of the project at the big conference, Matt Mullenweg, the Dries of WordPress, says, learn JavaScript deeply. It's basically like a homework assignment he's giving to the whole community. And people aren't quite sure how to take it. Calypso has come out recently. We know as web developers that JavaScript is only getting more and more important. But okay, if we learn JavaScript deeply, what exactly is that going to mean for us? There are some people who took that and ran with it, but for a lot of the WordPress community, it just kind of lingered for a year of, oh, we're supposed to be learning JavaScript deeply, aren't we? But why? So a year later, at the State of the Word again, Matt said that he was putting on his product lead hat again. Basically, he'd be taking a more direct role in guiding the development of WordPress core. Before this, he had distributed power a little bit more among community members, so that every 4 months a different community member was leading a release of WordPress. Every 4 months new features were added to WordPress core. But in December of 2016, Matt said, we're going to change that. I'll be taking more direct leadership, and the next change will be released when it's ready. Not in 4 months, but when it's ready. So no set releases. And the focus of that next release is going to be the editor. We're going to build a block-based editor. It's going to unify widgets. It's going to unify interfaces for shortcodes, the sort of wild, wild west of WordPress site building solutions. It's all going to come together with this block-based editor that we're going to build. And there wasn't much detail. The community kind of freaked out a little bit because suddenly that learn JavaScript deeply assignment suddenly felt a whole lot more real. Suddenly, okay, the block or the editor is going to be rewritten as a block editor, whatever that might mean, and it's probably going to be written in React because that's what Calypso is written in, and we have to learn Babel, we have to learn ES6, and we've got to learn all these new things, and we're not quite sure why. It was a whole lot of confusion. I do credit that core community, that core set of developers, for really laying out the goals that they were trying to achieve. I think one thing the WordPress community does really well, at least as was reflected in the Gutenberg development, was explain why they were going to do what they're going to do. We'll see that it didn't fully alleviate community concerns until they saw Gutenberg, but I think it's really admirable the degree to which they thought about why they were undertaking this. So they set out the goals to let people create rich posts, not just people who know code, not just advanced site developers, but the people using WordPress. A more consistent interface, a better interface, unifying all of these different things. Again, WordPress just has a huge number of plugins available that can totally change the way you interact with WordPress. They also laid out a number of design principles. So everything is a block. we heard about this. If everything is a block, that'll simplify things. All blocks will be created equal, meaning you won't have to keep track of some blocks in some places, other blocks in other places. I think right now in Drupal, we have to remember like view modes are controlled here, and views are controlled over there, and blocks are controlled over there. Too many different places to try and keep track of where our metaphorical Lego blocks are. So in Gutenberg, they're all going to be in the same place. It's not going to be dependent on drag and drop. You should be able to use your keyboard. This may just sound like a detail here, but I thought it was important that they just said this up front. I think there's an assumption, at least I would have assumed, oh, this is going to be drag and drop dependent. I think maybe I would have assumed that because so many things in Drupal are drag and drop. Placeholders are key. We saw this kind of with that bio post type. You should be able to look at something like the bio post type and see, oh, what am I supposed to fill in here? So if it's a recipe, you get placeholders, and you can just fill them in. Direct manipulation. You should, if you want to, be able to see the HTML behind any one of these blocks and directly edit it. Customization. This editor needs to be customizable. WordPress, like Drupal, has a community of plugin developers, like module developers, who need to be able to extend things even further. Another thing that I thought was really admirable, really long, thoughtful blog posts explaining why they were doing what they were doing. Dries does this to some degree in the Drupal community. Matt Mullenweg does this as well. He wrote a really long blog post. We called it Gutenberg for a reason, explaining the goals, explaining in sometimes abstract, sometimes concrete ways why they're doing what they're doing. Some things I just want to call out from this particular post. Plugin developers will be able to completely integrate into every part of WordPress, including posts, pages, custom post types, sidebars, without having to hack TinyMCE, squeeze their entire feature behind a toolbar menu. Today, every plugin that extends WordPress does it in a different way. Gutenberg blocks provide a single, easy-to-learn entry point for an incredible variety of extensions. Think about now, even in Drupal 8, we have the idea of plugins. That's made it, I think, a little bit easier for module developers to know how they're supposed to extend Drupal. Pretty much everything is a plugin, but still it's a lot of different plugin systems you have to learn. There's still a lot of ways to extend Drupal, perhaps too many ways. Part of the idea of Gutenberg is it's minimizing the number of ways you can extend, hopefully making it easier for plugin developers. And for those end users, they'll finally be able to build the sites they see in their imaginations. That's a really ambitious goal. I don't know if that'll be fully achieved, but to just write that in a blog post and say this is what we're going for. People who don't know code, people who aren't going to edit PHP, aren't going to edit HTML, will still be able to build the sites they see in their imagination. Mateus Ventura, one of the lead developers of Gutenberg, wrote another really long blog post explaining how they're going to do this without breaking everything. How can we do this without dismantling, rebuilding, fragmenting, or breaking up the WordPress ship that for over a decade has been carrying the thoughts, joys, and livelihoods of millions of people for more than a quarter of the web? I think it's really admirable that they were this thoughtful. Even with all this forethought, even with all of this prose written about why they were doing what they were doing, there's still a huge amount of community resistance. I thought of including some of the angry comments and posts. There were many, but eventually those started to die down. Another big moment in Gutenberg history, the React relicensing. So, as I mentioned, Automatic had built Calypso, that React Native application, and there were some concerns about, wait, is there this potential problem with the licensing clause in React? I'm not going to try and explain the licensing clause here, because what I learned through that conversation is that unless you're a lawyer, you're probably going to get it wrong. But suffice it to say, a lot of developers were worried about the way in which React was licensed. WordPress said, we're not going to use it, even though we've spent a lot of time writing Gutenberg so far in React. With this patents clause in the React license, we're just not going to use it. And that, probably more than anything else, is the reason that Facebook relicensed React as MIT. I think it was a good example of how open source communities can throw their weight around. WordPress runs 30% of the internet. For them to say, we're not going to use your library because it doesn't have the right license, carries a lot of weight. They also eventually put out mock-ups of what this is going to look like. They put out code samples of how you might use it, but still the community was nervous. Still there's a lot of angst around what is this really going to do? Even with command line samples of here's a command line tool that will just create blocks for you. The community was still nervous. Even with detailed prose docs directly in the GitHub repo. This I think is really impressive. Writing the docs before the project is complete. Don't write the docs after the thing has already gone into the core. Write the docs first. Still the community is nervous. The big turning point for certainly me, and I think most of the community, was the State of the Word in 2017. So again, this is an event like the Dries Note. It's the project leader giving a usually hour-long or more presentation about the state of the project. In the middle of that presentation this year, he brings up Matthias Ventura, the lead developer of Gutenberg, who does a 15-minute live demo of Gutenberg. And that changed everything for everybody. Seeing it in action, live, on a real laptop, not a video that may or may not be a reality. I think that's what we often see in these Drupal keynotes. We see videos of potential functionality, and it's hard to know how real was that. This felt very real for the whole community. We knew that this is a live demo. This might fail, but he still showed an incredible feature set. He showed how people are going to use it. He prioritized that role of the content author. During the Q&A afterwards, someone came up and said that coming into the conference, coming into the presentation, he was 90% scared about Gutenberg and 10% excited. But after a 15-minute live demo, he had flipped. He was 90% excited, 10% still a little bit scared. And that's the way I felt as well. There's a great example of just showing what the thing is really doing, alleviating concerns. Matt went on to say that it's not just going to be the editor. The editor is only phase one. Eventually it'll build on to customizing the whole page. It'll build on to theming as well. So again, I think this is a good reflection of a difference between WordPress and Drupal. WordPress specifically starting with making it usable for content editors, making it usable for people who know the least about code and the least about how WordPress is built before extending it and making it more complicated for developers who are going to control the entire page. Drupal more likely to do the opposite, go outside in. So the community really got on board after that keynote. At camps all over the world, WordPress has a big camp ecosystem like Drupal camps. There were whole tracks dedicated at conferences to learning modern JavaScript techniques. Once people got on board, they really got on board. The major plugins like Advanced Custom Fields said, all right, well, this is really happening. Our top goal now needs to be getting ourselves Gutenberg compatible. Prominent community members like Daniel Bachhuber, the maintainer of the WP CLI, he writes blog posts that get posted on Pantheon telling people how they can convert those short codes to Gutenberg blocks. We do webinars. There are community members who are doing paid and free training courses. There's now an even more advanced command line tool that will stub out a Gutenberg block all for you. And now WordPress really is embracing JavaScript. I was on a webinar recently with Mel Choice, one of the lead designers of Gutenberg, and she said that Automatic, this sort of Acquia of WordPress, is now perhaps more a JavaScript company than it is a PHP company. There are more people actively writing JavaScript than writing PHP. And while that's great, it's great that they've embraced modern JavaScript, I think the bigger change for the overall community is thinking in terms of blocks, getting a community-wide consensus around what do we mean when we refer to these front-end blocks. It's going to be a Gutenberg block. I think Drupal would benefit from a similar crystallization of what we mean when we say blocks. Special thanks to Andrew Taylor, another Pantheor, who did a presentation at DrupalCon with me. He made some of these slides, and also again that product designer at Automatic, Mel Choice, she did a webinar with me and really helped shape my thinking on Gutenberg here. We've got plenty of time for questions here. Brian?
I guess aside from the general statement that you think that within Drupal, having some consistency around blocks and how they're used would be a good thing.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts about how we could get there? I know it's a pretty broad question.
Yeah, I think we as a community need to decide what things we want to stop using. So, as I showed, I think there are too many layers at which you can customize things. In my previous job when I was building sites, I'd like to use layouts, panels layouts usually, which have kind of become the layouts that are now in Drupal 8 core. I tried to use that as the unit at which I would think in terms of blocks. And one of the reasons I like to do that was because I could then apply that at like the view mode level in Panelizer. I could apply it at the Drupal block level with mini panels, or the whole page with panels everywhere. But I could think, all right, layout plugins are my block unit. That means let's use pre-processing as little as possible. Don't pre-process, like, I was on a big project right before I switched jobs, and I encouraged, let's not do any pre-processing on fields, let's not do any pre-processing on nodes, because when you've got a dozen content types, when you have dozens of custom modules, it can be really hard to find all of those different pre-process hooks. I think one of the most important virtues a finished Drupal site can have is that people who are charged with maintaining the site can look at the Drupal UI and know how the configuration leads to what they see on the front end. I think if you rely on pre-processing, there's a very good chance that you are going to make your administrative UI inaccurate. You're going to do something that results in the administrative UI saying something like, this is an unordered list. Okay, but in the rendered presentation, it's a slideshow. How did we get from the admin UI saying this is an unordered list to the UI, to the actual UI being a slideshow? Often some pre-process and template overriding magic that's scattered in 3 different places. So I think pre-processing is a good place to stop doing complex things that are more discoverably done in like field formatters or layout plugins that will allow you to just like look at the UI and see what it does, and then it actually does it.
Cool.
What does the data model behind all these blocks look like? That's part one. Part two, how does that translate to, let's say you've got 10,000 pages all written with blocks taking over the body field, and then you want to move away from WordPress and migrate that content. Are you left with a body field filled with markup, or is there a nice data model behind this whole architecture?
Yeah, so the base of the data model is the body field with HTML comments delineating all the blocks. So it gets down to the level of like every paragraph tag is a separate block. So you end up with HTML comments around every single paragraph tag or block quote or heading saying this is the start and stop of a block. So if you like, you could migrate that to Drupal, migrate that body field to the Drupal body field, and all that HTML would just continue being the same HTML. You'd have these comments which didn't do anything in Drupal. Drupal would have no way of parsing those comments and knowing what the different Gutenberg blocks were, but you would have functional HTML.
What's the way to work with that data, other than editing your body field?
Yeah. And for a lot of use cases, I think that's problematic. For instance, to just go back to that like bio post type, I would want to think of these as discrete fields: name, job title, biography, image. 4 fields that are saved separately in the database, so that if I've got 1,000 employees and I want to move the job title above the name, or if I want to put the image above the job title, it's a change in one template. As the data gets stored here, it's these 4 things in this order.
Right.
Like, if I was doing this in Drupal with just Drupal fields and I wanted to change the order, all I would need to do is like drag one field above the other in the display settings, and that'd be it. If I wanted to do that in Gutenberg, as it exists now, as it's being showed here, I would need to update the body field of every single post of this type. And that sounds awful. I think it's my expectation that advanced custom fields, the CCK of WordPress, will give you a way to have this user interface, but the data storage of advanced custom fields, so that all these different things can be saved to their own fields, so that you can reorder them in one template or one configuration, and then get what you want. For the time being, this is so far being led in core, and the plugins are trying to catch up. But it's my expectation that advanced custom fields will figure that out one way or another.
In this page, you mentioned that this would be the equivalent of a content type with specific fields.
Mm-hmm.
But like, even though you have these placeholders, is that still like one body field only?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Even the title, like when you put your name.
The title, I think, gets saved separately. Yeah, the title is like the post title.
And like, is there like this is going to be released when it is ready? But like,
Mm-hmm.
what is there like a feature set of when? Like, is there a definition of ready, or this is just going to?
Probably. It's all being developed on GitHub, and they've been pretty organized about setting different milestones. But I think that the clearest answer will come from the State of the Word that comes at WordCamp Europe in a couple days. I'm not expecting it to be released at WordCamp Europe, but I'm expecting more clarity around what done will mean. It seems like released when it's ready for Gutenberg has meant something similar to Drupal 8 being released when it's ready, when it just seems like it's getting pushed out and out and out. And it's hard to know exactly when it'll be called ready.
A question about, I don't know if there's any conversations going on about content personalization within this
Mm-hmm.
sort of framework, and how that would work with advanced caching validation, things like that.
Mm-hmm. It just occurred to me I should probably be repeating the questions here for the recording. The question here was, has there been any thought about personalization? And I imagine what you're talking about is, say, changing the values of certain blocks depending on the personalization profile of the person visiting the site and the cache implications. My hope is that Gutenberg would make the places that are personalized clearer. If, for instance, you wanted to say like a sidebar of content you might like. Right now, that can be done in any number of ways. Like, it would be the site developer's preference to figure out, is that something I'm going to insert just somewhat hard-coded into the theme? Like, here's a place where that personalized thing just happens. Is it going to be a widget, kind of the current WordPress equivalent to Drupal blocks? Is it going to be a widget that's placed via the widget user interface? Or is it going to be something that's done as kind of like an alter hook? So it's my expectation that with Gutenberg saying everything's a block, there'll at least be a unified way to say, if what you want is a personalized something, it's got to be a Gutenberg block.
Right. And handling the caching within the whole body would be something else to consider.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the caching implications is a question of, do you want the personalized data coming out in the initial HTML response? Basically, do you want your server or CDN maintaining a large number of personalized caches? You could do that, I assume, with an edge side include. I think the dominant way of doing that kind of personalization now is with JavaScript.
The placeholders.
Yeah, placeholders in JavaScript. You call out to some third-party service that says like, hey, put the personalization here, and then too many seconds later you get the personalized content loaded. And I think all that would continue working. Like, that part, I don't think would be all that different because of Gutenberg. I think what Gutenberg would change is the site administrators and content editors' ability to understand how that content is getting there. But like the
authoring experience, like
yeah,
adding personalized data.
yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah.
It sounds like this has a lot more to do with the community moving towards JavaScript than actually maybe the printing stuff. Can you talk a little bit more about your observations there? It sounds like, is it Matt
Mm-hmm.
that kind of said, hey, as a community, we're going to move towards JavaScript. Can you talk a little bit more about your observations there?
Yeah, so the question is just, what does this what does this mean for the JavaScript side of things? Is this more about JavaScript than it is about rewriting the editor? I don't know that it's more about JavaScript per se. I think WordPress as a community is really good at figuring out what benefits they want to get for whom, and I think they figured out the thing they want is for content creators to be able to understand the composition of their sites better, and they then, I think, assumed that in order to do that, they need the browser tooling to be more interactive, less, waiting for AJAX communications to go back and forth. So I think they just went pretty quickly from we need more control closer to the user to that probably needs to be in JavaScript. And I think they're just recognizing that the wider web development community is assuming more and more that the way we control our DOM, the way we control our HTML is with JavaScript-based tooling. So I first heard about web components at Twin Cities Drupal 5 years ago, and I thought, yes, that's what we need. A definition of our Lego blocks that browsers understand, an ability to create bigger and bigger Lego blocks that aren't just like CMS-specific templates that are understood server-side, but then what gets sent out to the browser is just like the same blobs of HTML. There is a need for a definition of component that is understandable by browsers, and JavaScript is leading the way, or JavaScript has to be involved in defining those things. So it's still my expectation that 5 years from now, we'll be thinking in terms of web components or React elements or Vue components or whatever it is. But I'm pretty sure 3 years ago I also said it's 5 years away. So who knows how long it truly is away until we're serving out only web components or serving out only React components. But I think what this does is start to set the table for we need to be doing more of our work in JavaScript, because eventually that's going to be the language we have to be working in for much of what we do building websites.
Are there plans to support automatic migration from the current body field or ACF or whatever it is called to the new editor?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the question is about migratability or backwards compatibility, and I think yes. Like if Gutenberg comes out in Drupal WordPress core and breaks everything, that's going to be a failure. Like WordPress as a community has a long-standing expectation that core updates can be applied and stuff doesn't break. Like far more than the Drupal community, they expect to be able to apply core updates and everything keeps working. So if that's violated by Gutenberg, it's going to be revolt in the WordPress community. I think the state of things now is that when Gutenberg is added to WordPress core, it'll be added as an opt-out feature, meaning as soon as you install the WordPress 5.0, you'll just get Gutenberg on unless you have a plugin or something else specifically turning it off. But quite honestly, I don't expect that conversation to be resolved until it actually happens. I think there are people who just keep going back and forth on it needs to be opt-in, no, it needs to be opt-out, and I won't believe it. I won't believe either until it actually happens.
A comment. This reminds me a lot of, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Jeff Eaton's talk about the battle of the body field that we've known for years, and that the work that is already done as far as embedding media into the body field seems like it's fairly close to providing some of this functionality, but not sort of a lot of the advanced styling of those embedded elements. I don't know what way does that resonate?